right after you purchased the Canon R6. Is it your testimony you did not ask for higher frame rates and resolution right after you purchased the Canon R6? Is that your testimony?
Regardless of what day you believe it was within the world time zone, I don't believe that someone who has gone through slow motion dependency, who has lost the ability to enjoy B-roll in real-time speed, because that's what slow motion does. Your body no longer makes you film in real-time speed, but real-time speed is, as you know, I imagine, is what makes our video more
I appreciate that, but my question wasn't that.
I'm just trying to school you.
Right after you purchased the Canon R6, it's entirely possible that you were asking for higher frame rates and resolution.
Objection
yes
calls for speculation.
What's up guys, Dan Furlani here and welcome back to a new video. If you're new to this channel, there's one thing you need to know. I make videos with and about the Canon 90D, the Canon EOS R, the Canon M50 and the Canon R6. This one, filming right now. What do I talk about today? I want to talk about slow motion. What about it? We know that when we shoot a B-roll, most of the times we look for the best frame rate to achieve the best slow motion. And by the way, when we shoot a B-roll, we're not obliged to use slow motion. We can shoot it in real time too, But in this video, I want to talk about slow motion. And when it comes to the Canon R6, we have two different options. One is the 120 frames per second. And the other, the 4K 60. What's the difference? When we shoot 120 frames per second, the footage slows down automatically. Like in the file we get, it's already slowed down by 25%. And its speed will be 25% of real-time speed. When we shoot in 4K 60 frames per second, we get a 60 frames per second file that we have to slow down in post. And we can slow it down only to 50%. But let's see, how do we shoot in 120 frames per second on the Canon R6? Okay, you just open the menu and there, not here, otherwise you will just see the different resolutions, but not the high frame rates. So click there on the high frame rate to enable it. And the first thing we notice, we get a warning that in whatever you'll record in this specific frame rate, like high frame rate, 120 frames per second, there will be no audio. But for the rest, everything is fine, because unlike other cameras, like the Canon EOS R, for example, we keep the autofocus. And that's just awesome. Okay, and then you go back, exit the menu, and we see through the LCD screen. And when we shoot in 24 frames per second, the shutter speed should be 1/50th of a second. But now that we're shooting 120 frames per second, as you know, as I already told you many times, we should double it. So 240, but we don't have 240, so 250, and you're good to go. Then, considering that when you increase the shutter speed, the footage gets darker and it might be underexposed. In that case, if you can't widen the aperture any farther, because for example you already have f2.8 and that's the maximum aperture of this lens, for example, or whatever the maximum aperture, if you're already there and it's underexposed, you can change the ISO. For example, from 800, which is the basic ISO, the native ISO of the Canon R6 when shooting C-Log 3, we can set it to 1600, and it seems like it's decently exposed, right? Right. No. Warning. It doesn't matter what you see from the screen or from the indicators there. When you shoot in C-Log 3, especially when you're shooting 120 frames per second, you really want to overexpose the shot. Seriously. So I'd rather set the ISO to 3200. Okay. So why did I say that you have to overexpose it? Because according to my own experience, first of all, if you underexpose it, or if you expose it properly and you want to recover something in the shadows, you just can't. It would be grainy. When it's overexposed, you can bring down the highlights with no problem, and you recover almost everything. You can recover almost anything. Also, one more reason to overexpose, of course not too much, but quite a bit, when you shoot in C-Log, and especially when you shoot 120 frames per second, it's because, I don't know why, for some reasons, when I shoot in high frame rates, like 120 frames per second for slow motion, this camera, unlike when shooting at different resolutions, it tends to get really grainy, like with digital noise. So to avoid that, overexpose it a bit. Then, warning, if you were shooting in 24 frames per second, then you decided to shoot a B-roll in slow motion in 120, then you're done, and you want to go back to shooting in 24 frames per second, it's not enough just to disable the high frame rate. Because when you do that, the camera automatically, just like all Canon cameras, goes to 60 frames per second. So keep that in mind. You have to physically change it through the menu to 24 frames per second. Then when you go back from the LCD screen, adjust the shutter speed, adjust the ISO. And Bob's your uncle. So these settings, you can get some awesome buttery, melting, creamy, smooth, awesome slow motion. So as I said, when you shoot 120 frames per second, it slows down to 25% speed. Now the thing is that the quality on this camera, the 120 frames per second, it's in 1080. It's not in 4K. So if you want to shoot a slow motion in 4K with the Canon R6, the maximum frame rate is 60. And you can slow down the footage in post to 50%. I mean, it's not really slow, but it depends on the shot. For me, it works most of the times. But let's see, what do we have to do to shoot in 60 frames per second 4K on the Canon R6? Okay, again, we enter the menu. We go to movie rec quality, movie rec size, and here is the first one on the top there on the left, 60 frames per second. Then we exit the menu, and from the live screen, we adjust the shutter speed. So 60 frames per second, 60, double, 120, 125th of a second. Then, if the shot is underexposed, ISO, and we can set it to, in this case, for example, 1600, and it's properly exposed. Of course, my advice is to overexpose it a little bit when you can. So, and don't worry, because like 1600, 3200, or even more, it's not really gonna affect the quality of the footage produced by this awesome camera. Again, when you go back to shooting in 24 frames per second or 30, if you shoot 30, well, whatever your choice, just remember after changing frame rate, when you go back to the menu, adjust the shutter speed and the ISO. So what's my favorite frame rate? 120 in 1080 or 4K 60? The 120 frames per second, it keeps the ability to focus, autofocus, but on the other side, it's in 1080, and according to my experience, as I mentioned, it tends to produce some digital noise pretty easily if you're not careful. The 4K 60, It's not as slow, it's not as buttery as the 120, but it's 4K, and most of the times it's more than good enough. So let's say what I prefer, it depends on the situation, but I'm telling you, I'm shooting a lot on 4K 60. Alright, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash the like button and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next video.